All our Monday Senate utilities to order. First thing up, just want to announce there will be a little change on the schedule. We'll probably move the neutrals to later in the week and move up the opponents. That way, there's some scheduling we're working on. We're going to try to accommodate everybody's scheduling as we can. First, next thing is bill introductions. Do we have one? Go ahead. Okay. Do we have any questions? Do we have any objections? The bill's introduced. Thank you, Ally. Do we have any other bills? Not seeing any. We'll move on. This is the last day we can take bill introductions, so everything will have to come through exempt committee. First thing is a hearing on Senate Bill 68. Nick, you want to give us an overview of the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. And Mr. Chairman and committee members, in your packet, you've got a memo that goes over the bill, provides you a briefing on that bill. And then also included is a summary of other state ROFR litigation, right of first refusal litigation. And Mr. Chair, if you just want me to cover the bill, that's fine, and provide this for informational purposes only.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Thanks.
So, committee, Senate Bill 68 would enact a right of first refusal for incumbent electric transmission owners to construct, upgrade, and maintain an electric transmission line that is approved for construction in a Southwest Power Pool transmission plan. The bill talks about it as a regional transmission organization, but we're in the Southwest Power Pool, so it would apply to those lines. So the ROFR would apply to any incumbent electric transmission owner if the transmission facility is connecting to that incumbent's facilities. If it were to connect to multiple incumbent facilities, the ROFR would be decided between the two electric transmission providers. So to exercise this right for a right of first refusal, the incumbent electric transmission facility or owner would have to notify the RTO or the Southwest Power Pool that they intend to exercise that right. And then they would also be required to seek a certificate of convenience and necessity from the KCC to be permitted to begin that project. What the bill would also provide is that if an incumbent transmission owner does not wish to construct that transmission line, they could refuse that right. And then any other electric transmission owner could exercise or enter the market to build that transmission line. Subsection E of the bill would preserve an incumbent electric transmission owner's existing property rights, which include but are not limited to the right of a transmission owner to assign its rights to construct, upgrade, own, and maintain that transmission line. And then in the bill briefing, you can see some definitions of terms. So these electric transmission lines would be the larger lines that are over 100 kilovolts in size. And the definition for an incumbent electric transmission owner It's very broad. It means any corporation, company, individual, association of persons, their trustees, lessees, or receivers that now or hereinafter own, control, manage, except for private use, any equipment, plant, machinery for the generation or transmission of electric power. Again, there's definitions for the regional transmission organization and transmission, what a transmission plan is of that regional transmission organization. But again, in summary, this would give incumbent electric transmission owners a right to construct those regional transmission lines. And if they did not want to exercise that right, any other company could come in and construct that line. And Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Questions? Not seeing any. I'm sure we will have some down the road. Okay, our first presenter is, and we'll go ahead and open the hearings to the proponents, is Tony Clark, former commissioner of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Go ahead, Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Tony Clark. I'm a senior advisor at the firm of Wilkinson, Barker, Nauer, and I'm here representing our client, ITC Great Plains, in support of this bill. By way of background, prior to my current role, most of my career was spent in the public service side of things. In the mid-90s, I was a legislator from my home state of North Dakota, and then after that, served for 12 years as a member of the North Dakota Public Service Commission, which is roughly the equivalent of the KCC here in Kansas, although it's a publicly elected body. After 12 years on the North Dakota Commission, I was appointed to FERC, and from 2012 to 2016 served as a commissioner on FERC. So I'm hopeful that my background and perspective in terms of this particular issue of rights of first refusal, which is one that I've studied and dealt with for some period of time, will be helpful, especially coming from someone who tends to have a generally pro-state energy prerogative point of view. At the outset, I would note that you've probably heard a bit about this bill, and you may have heard from opponents of the legislation that this bill is a matter of free market competition versus monopolies, and through competition you'll get lower rates passed through to customers. But in this, it's sort of a nice sounding bumper sticker. But in the case of electric transmission, and specifically the wires portion of the electric utility industry, it really is not something that holds water in terms of context. And I think most regulators would agree, if the choice is between workable competition and regulation, you choose workable competition. If this was the case and this was the debate in this particular issue, I don't think there would be much of a debate at all. The issue here and the distinction is, in the absence of some sort of workable framework for competition, certain industries exhibit monopoly tendencies, and sometimes more traditional regulatory tools will offer a better outcome for consumers. And the electric industry is just one of those examples. Think of it this way. Whether you pass this legislation or not, at the end of the day, you will have electric monopoly transmission companies serving customers in Kansas. No customer gets to choose their own wire or which electric transmission or distribution company they get to use, like they would other consumer products. What is really the choice before you is whether Kansas utilities and Kansas customers will default to a federal process for soliciting and procuring certain types of transmission projects. And unfortunately, it's a solicitation process that in practice, and we've had close to 10 years now of practice with it, has not worked particularly well, and it hasn't driven those cost savings for customers. In fact, what we've seen coming out of that solicitation process is increasing costs and delayed projects coming online. So rather, the debate before you is about how to best structure your regulatory policy regarding the transmission monopolies that you're going to have regardless. At its heart, it's a debate about whether transmission should be regulated in the traditional way or through this alternate process, which FERC came up with, as I said, about 10 years ago. Basically, the idea that FERC came up with in Order 1000, which is the core order that we're talking about here, was a very expansive rule. There's a lot of parts to it. But what the commission did in part was said, for certain types of projects, they were eliminating what at the time was known as a federal right of first refusal. So the federal government had for a long time had this. States can have state rights of first refusal, and FERC recognized that even in the order itself. In the absence of a ROFR legislation like this, state procurement policy will default to the federal rules. While in theory one can understand what FERC was trying to do when it promulgated the rule, and it's perhaps understandable, I think what they were saying is, hey, let's try to interject some competition at some point into this basically monopoly industry. In practice, it's been a failure in terms of resulting in negative customer outcomes where it's been tried. To be clear, as I'm going to talk momentarily, I believe customer groups and policymakers will find that they're mistaken if they believe that rejecting a state ROFR law will equate to lower utility bills. In fact, if the legislation is not enacted, I believe the needed transmission will take longer to build and may end up actually costing customers more for states like Kansas if they don't adopt a ROFR law. So what will probably be as instructive to anything as you go through your debate and as you think through the implications of adopting a law like this, and I would note it's a law that's been adopted in many other states in the region, especially those like Kansas that maintain the vertically integrated regulated utility structure that you have. What will be as instructive for you as anything is looking at the real world outcomes of what has happened through this procurement policy if you default to the federal rules. And there'll be a paper that I believe it's either attached to my testimony or Mr. Leopold's, which will walk through the real world examples of what's happening where this procurement process is tried. It's a concentric report. It's by a consulting group called Concentric, which took a look at the few Order 1000 projects that have made its way through the gamut, and there haven't been a lot of them nationwide, but there have been a few, and looking at the actual results of what's happening through this sort of procurement process. As you heard earlier today, in the absence of something like this, if SPP, if the regional planner determines a line is built that qualifies for this planning, if you have a state ROFR in place, the incumbent utilities simply build it at a regulated rate. If you don't have a state ROFR in place, it goes through this solicitation process that I'm about to talk to you about. As noted in 2019 by the paper that Concentric put out, the average Order 1000 solicitation process to that point had taken over 500 days just to move from the solicitation process to the selection process when the lines go out for bidding. Some took well over 1,000 days. The RTOs themselves spend millions administering the process, and this is just part of the selection process. As I said, in the case of a more traditional state, the line is needed, it's ordered to be built, and the incumbent builds it at a regulated rate and overseen by regulators. The Concentric study highlights several case studies arising from this Order 1000 solicitation process. Now, in the interest of brevity, I won't detail all of the different case studies that are in there. You can look through that report and get some sense of it. But I will delve into one that I think is particularly instructive as to how this process can go off the rails and actually end up costing consumers more than if these projects were built in more traditional ways. So one instructive example is a project that is known as Artificial Island. This was one of the first projects that was procured through this Order 1000 solicitation process, and it was in New Jersey and Delaware. This is a project that was first identified by the RTO as early as 2012 and 2013 in an area that was identified as needing a transmission solution. PJM, which is the equivalent of SPP, but in the northeast part of the U.S., or at least that portion of it, solicited more than 2 dozen different ideas for alleviating the concern. By 2014, it had changed the technical aspects for the projects. Later in 2014, RTO staff recommended accepting a solution by one company, which was subsequently challenged by another company that lost out on the bid. The RTO board delayed the selection through 2014, including requesting assistance from FERC's Alternative Dispute Resolution Service. By 2015, the RTO board selected a different project. By 2016, the cost for that project had ballooned. This had caused the RTO to go back and rescope the entire project. Simultaneously, because the state of Delaware was so displeased with how my former agency, FERC, was going to allocate the costs for the projects, they were threatening to blow up their state siting statute so the project couldn't be built unless more of the costs were dumped onto the state of New Jersey. As you can guess, New Jersey didn't really appreciate that, so they litigated out the cost allocation aspects of that for several years. The project, you might be thinking, wow, this must have been quite the transmission project. It in total consisted of about 3 to 5 miles of transmission in southern New Jersey and Delaware. It finally, after years of delay, actually has been placed into service, although it was at a cost that allowed for a $20 million escalation over an original cost cap estimate. You can only imagine how much was spent in regulatory and appellate litigation throughout the course of the process, and perhaps just as problematically, the Concentric report in 2022, which they updated in a follow-up paper, has indicated that the project has had to be derated and undergo significant repairs in recent years for a number of, at least up until last fall, was still being repaired. It's little wonder that one utility executive on a panel that I testified in front of Congress regarding Order 1000, his quote was that he was a utility executive who had been involved in this. It indicated that, quote, the promised efficiency looks more like confusion, controversy, and chaos. So this is just one example. It's not the only one. If you look through the report, you'll see another Order 1000 project in New York that, as placed into service, came in 67% over the initial cost cap. There's an Indiana-Kentucky line which came in and is placed into service, was over 11% over the median bid that was offered. In California, there's another significant project that is already 61% over cost exceedance. It's not even in service yet and has had excessive delays. The challenge with the entire process is the game becomes, as a bidder, you just win the bid first. You do what you have to do to win the bid. Sometimes they will have sort of soft cost containment measures in there in the bid, but at the end of the day, because it's a monopoly utility, when it gets placed into service, it's put into a regular old rate of return rate, and the utility will seek to recover what the actual cost to construct it was, not what the bids were based upon. And so you have this flaw in the process, which is both delaying projects that may be needed getting built, but also at the end of the day ending up with a cost placed into service for customers that was above what it would have been if you just probably would have gone with the utility that serves the area. For me, as a recovering regulator, one of the interesting questions I think it raises is, well, why isn't it actually delivering cost reductions? You would think that this sort of solicitation might do it, and I think that's what FERC's thinking was when it went into it. And there was an affidavit that was filed by a PhD economist at FERC recently that tried to explain this, where he asked that same question. He basically, paraphrasing, but came up with 2 rationales for it. Number one was, first of all, you're not actually engaging in real sort of free market competition. You're just bidding to be the monopoly. So it's a lot different situation than one would think of normally. And then number 2, when the bidders are making bids, they're doing so from a point where they don't have very good information. So the incumbent utility may know, if I'm building a transmission line from point A to point B and I'm in this part of the state, and landowners want this type of pole construction because you can't farm very easily around another type of pole construction, or you build a pole in a certain way because that's what stands up to winters in Kansas and winds and ice storms and things like that. They'll tend to build a bid which is relatively realistic because they operate here all the time and they have to go in front of the KCC and state regulators and justify those kinds of costs. A merchant generator who has potentially much more tenuous relationship with the state and is really only responsible, except for siting, to FERC for rate regulation, the incentive is to just put in a bid to win it, but it may not have all of those things taken into consideration in terms of local knowledge of what it takes to get a line constructed in a particular geographic area. So it's really it's almost an asymmetry of information problem that leads to bids that aren't realistic, and ultimately customers end up paying for that. In closing, I would say, I should add just one more thing. I had indicated in talking about FERC, I think FERC itself has come to understand that they have an issue here. When you hear discussions about Order 1000 at FERC, it's very frequent that most people will admit that the process is broken. Now, what to do about it, that's a subject of open debate at FERC. I will indicate that FERC has released a notice of proposed rulemaking which would revise the original Order 1000 standards on federal rights of first refusal, and would allow in certain cases a limited federal right of first refusal being reinstated. And I think, I mean, it's still open. Who knows what FERC will do with that ultimate rule? But I think it's an acknowledgement that even as the agency that promulgated the rule, they understand that there's an issue here. And I think adopting a law like this can help alleviate some of the concerns for Kansas customers. In closing, I think there are good reasons that a growing number of states have already adopted ROFRs. If you haven't seen the map already, you probably will, a map of the Midwest and the Great Plains, which indicates that a number of states have adopted these. And in most cases, when they've been challenged, they've been upheld by the federal courts. There was a little bit different ruling in Texas, where part of the state, the federal court overruled the ROFR in Texas. But for the most part, and for laws that are structured generally like this one that you have before you, the federal courts have upheld them in Minnesota, Iowa, and elsewhere. As I said, especially here in the Midwest, where utilities are overwhelmingly vertically integrated, state-regulated utilities, state leaders have come to an understanding that the results of the Order 1000 solicitation process are not meeting the promises that have been made in support of it. This has been on a bipartisan basis, from ruby red Republican pro-free market competition Texas, where they adopted a state ROFR on the wires portion of the business, understanding that it's a natural monopoly, all the way to Minnesota and everywhere in between. They're seeing that consumer benefits and accountability comes from a more straightforward regulatory structure that tends to get the needed transmission built on time, and built on budget. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Sure. Do we have questions? Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it. On states that do have the ROFR laws, are the vast majority of the projects end up falling under this new process? And what happens to the projects that the utility turns down? I mean, still go through a bidding process, I'm sure.
Sure. So, and thank you for the question, Senator, about the bidding process. I would say this, and I don't know that I mentioned it, but there is, in states that have ROFR laws, where the competition takes place is in the bidding for labor and the bidding for material, for construction, things like that. And so the regulator oversees that portion to ensure that the utility isn't self-dealing and doing things like that. So that's where the competitive procurement comes in those states. In terms of the projects that are built in those states, this is true in states that have ROFRs and true in states that do not have ROFRs. Most of the transmission projects that are built today are not done through this Order 1000 process. Most are still done in a way where they're built in what we call the local zone, and the costs are allocated to local ratepayers. And those types of projects are not eligible for Order 1000 treatment. I think there was an acknowledgement at FERC when you deal with more local projects, especially projects needed for reliability needs, because reliability is so critical, and sometimes you simply need a line built relatively quickly, that forcing it through this complex bidding bureaucracy didn't make much sense. So, so in most states, regardless, most projects are being built at the local level. In the case of states that have ROFRs, probably MISO, which is the RTO, just kind of to the east and north and south of SPP, it might be the best example. The upper Midwest, most states have ROFRs, and they're what happens when MISO, and most states are vertically integrated as well. So when MISO determines a line is to be built, the incumbent utilities simply go out and build the needed line, and then they seek to place that in the cost of that in rates, but via regulation and at a cost of service rate.
And the RTO is the one who oversees the bidding process on the Rule 1000?
No, Senator, those sorts of projects will be studied by the RTO, but they're not necessarily directed by the RTO in the same way that these Order 1000 projects, which are really FERC's idea was sort of the larger regional and interregional projects that might be hooking up, a much larger region would be the ones, and would be allocated cost-wise across the region, are the ones that would qualify for this process.
Senator Peterson?
Are there any steps that states should take to contain those costs on competitive projects?
Mr. Chairman and Senator, states in some ways are somewhat limited on some of those costs. So if you look at the ballooning costs that have happened on a lot of these Order 1000 projects, if it's a merchant facility, for example, those rates are regulated by FERC. Because they're interstate, they're part of the interstate tariff, states can intervene in the FERC proceedings. And the KCC, I know over the years has been active in FERC proceedings. I can't recall if it was, probably not on Order 1000 because there haven't been many projects built. But that would be the place for states to intervene. Now, in the absence of that, if you have a local state utility, a utility in the state that is serving customers in Kansas, the state does have more regulatory tools because states oversee the retail rate side of regulation for utilities.
Other questions?
Mr. Chair, may I have one online?
Who's this?
Senator Pittman,
Go ahead.
just one question. Thank you, Tony, for the testimony. Just a quick question on, you mentioned the difference in reliability that you might get in a bid from a utility versus maybe a competitive bid from a I forget what you call it, merchandising transmission company. Does the line not have specs already built in that are a minimum spec that are expected to, I mean, are they not identical lines necessarily when these two companies are bidding them? Isn't there a spec that this needs to have certain conditions? I'm really kind of confused about that piece.
Sure, Senator, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. It's a good one. There are certain minimum specs that the electric industry simply has. I mean, that you have to build to code certain things. But beyond that, there's a lot of choices that a developer would have, and some might be initially more expensive, but might better serve customers over the lifetime of the plant itself. You can construct poles in different ways. Some are more durable and better under certain weather conditions than others. But in the case of SPP itself isn't sort of dictating and mandating all of those specific matters for how a line gets constructed. I would think of it more in the context of SPP may have certain specifications, certain qualifications, but in general they're saying, look, there needs to be a line of this voltage built from here to here, but then there's a wide latitude of choices that the different bidders might have underneath that. And I think we're finding in some cases that simply accepting the low bid may not actually end up being the lowest cost for consumers in the long run.
Thanks.
Senator Francisco?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. You spoke some about utilities having the ability to develop within their local region. Is there any concern that the utilities would choose to develop within their local region if there isn't a ROFR to help to extend that reliability? And rather than having those transmission lines shared, as might be required by a line constructed on SPP, going all to that one utility rate base?
Senator, it's a very perceptive question because it's one of the issues that's been debated at FERC and elsewhere, which is, are utilities building more of these local projects when you might be better off building a larger regional project? And that actually is one of the sort of overall concerns that I would have with Order 1000 is that the bidding bureaucracy has become so complex and litigious that utilities, for good reason and sort of sensibly, are avoiding that entire process and instead looking at smaller projects and upgrades. The question is, what do you do about that? And that's one of the issues that FERC is trying to, I think, wrestle with head on, which is there are two ways to deal with it. One would be lift the onerous regulations on the Order 1000 projects and just acknowledge that this is basically a monopoly industry and have the incumbents build it at a regulated rate, and it may happen more organically in that case. And that's what we've seen in, for example, MISO. There's actually been a more robust transmission build out of regional projects because you have a lot of states with ROFRs and that have vertically integrated utilities. And so the state sort of pulling in the same direction as the RTO. The other option, which is one that I disagree with, but that folks have presented to FERC, is, well, what you need to do is impose the Order 1000 solicitation process at lower and lower voltages, sort of deeper and deeper into the grid, so you're bidding out even more of the utility grid. I actually think that would be would have some very negative effects, because now you're getting into true reliability projects and things like that. And if you're subjecting the lights need to stay on sort of project to this sort of bidding regime, which can take years to sort through, and as I said, it's very litigious and sort of bureaucracy laden, I think that would be bad for consumers.
Okay, we got time for one further question. Senator Fag.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Clark, for your presentation. It's my understanding that ITC at one time was against ROFR, or now it's in favor. Can you kind of speak what changed in that a little bit?
Sure. Actually, I'll defer that question to Mr. Leopold, who's with ITC, but
We can do that in a minute then.
yeah, he'll address that when he speaks.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Not seeing any. Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to Brent Leopold, ITC Vice President.
Good afternoon. I'm Brett Leopold, President of ITC Great Plains, and I'm here to speak in support of Senate Bill 68. Let me jump right to Senator Fagg's question that Tony Clark said that I would answer. It is true and often pointed out that in 2014, ITC opposed a right of first refusal in the state of Kansas. The explanation for that is that Order 1000 came out in 2011. Some of you may not be surprised to learn that 3 years later, the federal government was still trying to implement that order. They still hadn't developed the process. Not a single project had yet been submitted through an Order 1000 process in the Southwest Power Pool or in the state of Kansas. So we were still in 2014, 9 years ago, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, operating in good faith that maybe this would be an instance where a federal administrative process would serve some meaningful and valuable purpose. Our history here in Kansas has been to be skeptical of federal regulatory overreach, whether it's energy industry regulation, healthcare regulation, or other forms of regulation. What we now know with 9 years of evidence is there's a compelling case that we were wrong in 2014, and we changed our position, and we now support right of first refusal as the best public policy and the best law for the state of Kansas. The year after we opposed ROFR in Kansas was actually in 2015 was the first time that the Southwest Power Pool identified a project that would be subject to their new federally mandated process. It happened to be a small project in Sunflower's territory in southwest Kansas. They took an entire year with 10 or 11 bidders, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars preparing bids, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars of SPP staff and administrative time. And that SPP staff time is charged to the retail ratepayers in the region. At the end of that process, they ended up awarding the project to the incumbent, Sunflower Electric. Subsequently, it was subject to restudy. It was determined the project was not needed, and it was never built. Those were the fruits of the first Order 1000 project in Southwest Power Pool. And as it continued to be implemented around the country, they had similarly poor and disheartening results. So the evidence that we've seen and that evidence that we'll be presenting to this committee is why we support right of first refusal in Kansas. I think that the concerns of the committees and the concerns of the opponents about this legislation focus heavily on the retail rates that are being charged to customers in Kansas. There's been a particular focus in the legislature and at the Kansas Corporation Commission on the retail rates that Evergy charges for several years now. There have been a number of studies and a number of different approaches to addressing that issue. What I'm here to tell you is that opposing this right of first refusal bill will not solve your your rate problem in Kansas. In fact, it'll exacerbate and worsen your retail rate issue in Kansas. You need to, fully understand that the right of first refusal only applies to a very limited specialized set of high voltage regional projects. They don't come along every day. And the costs of those projects, because of their size and because of the benefits that they generate, not only for the state and the region, the costs are shared throughout the Southwest Power Pool footprint, with ratepayers across the state of Kansas paying approximately 16.5% of the cost of that line. The transmission component of the bill in Kansas historically has been often under 10%. Today, I don't know what it represents. It could be more than that, but I can safely tell you that 80 to 85% of the bill that most retail ratepayers pay is part of the generation and distribution costs, not the transmission costs. So let's imagine a perfect scenario where this federally regulated process is working perfectly and it's delivering the occasional high voltage transmission line at a lower cost than what the incumbent might have built it for. That cost savings is chipping away at that 10 to 15% of your bill, which is already being shared regionally so that Kansas is only picking up 16.5% of the bill. That's your best case scenario in terms of tackling your retail rate issue in Kansas. It's not going to be helpful at all. But I will tell you that the real world is we're not getting that perfect utopian scenario where these projects are being built expeditiously, timely, and for a lower cost and at the same level of reliability that the incumbent would build it for. Instead, we're finding, as Commissioner Clark mentioned, it's taking, there's long periods of delay to get these projects planned, developed, approved, go through the solicitation process. Depending on the entity that wins the solicitation process, they may have additional year or more of state regulatory process that they need to go for before they're authorized to build the line. And it's significant. This timing issue is really critical because delay in needed beneficial transmission is costing your Kansas ratepayers money. That project is designed to deliver benefits in excess of costs, which is primarily measured in the form of access to cheaper, abundant generation in the footprint, but also through the reliability benefits. If you're delaying a project by 2 or 3 years, that delay is taking money out of Kansas ratepayer pockets. Then you have ultimately the project gets constructed. You have the upfront costs. Again, let's imagine that a competitive developer wins a project. They have no relationship to the Kansas retail ratepayers like your incumbent utilities do. And they build this project and the day one cost is perhaps lower than what the incumbent would have spent. But what standard did they build it to? What material choices did they make? Because you can, people will point out that often developers will offer cost caps. Frequently, there are exemptions in those cost caps. But again, let's imagine that cost cap is real and stringent and enforceable. Now, you're a developer building a project. Your project starts to run over costs. Now you're in this very dangerous situation where if you spend above the cap, you're losing money, or you're put on pressure. You're put under pressure to find ways to perhaps reduce the cost of your construction. And these lines are in service for 40, 60, 80 years. So the upfront cost is important, but the operation and maintenance cost over time is very, very important as well. You can easily, and this is what the experience is showing, over time, we think that these projects are going to cost even more to Kansas ratepayers because the upfront decisions and the upfront construction costs can be outstripped by the ongoing maintenance, repair, and operation costs. I also wanted to talk about, there is a common criticism that somehow State ROFR would be subject to. Oh, I forgot I had slides. Let's click to the last slide. They tell me that visual is a good way to learn. So let's just go past the ITC Great Plains stuff. You won't be alone here in Kansas if you decide to adopt a state ROFR. Let's go to the last slide, sir. Yeah, just leave it there. Thank you. So you can see Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Michigan, all those places have state ROFR. We've seen it passed by big Republican majorities. We've seen it passed on a bipartisan basis. We've seen state ROFRs signed in recent years by a Republican governor in Iowa, by a Democratic governor in Michigan. So the trend in our region is, let's reject, federal usurpation of deciding about who builds and regulates transmission in our state, and let's implement state right of first refusal legislation. You will hear that the Texas statute, Texas, as many of you know, is unique in that they've largely separated themselves from most of the country. They're not subject to most FERC regulation. There is a piece of mostly eastern Texas that is part of MISO and falls under FERC. They did pass a statute a few years ago that was a form of right of first refusal legislation. I will tell you that that legislation that's currently pending, it was ruled unconstitutional by the Fifth Circuit, and it's maybe headed to the Supreme Court. The bill that you have before you is nothing like that Texas legislation, which by and large was designed to slam the door from allowing entities into that state in the future to build or own or buy transmission. Very expansive. The bill that you have before you is modeled after bills in Minnesota, Iowa that have been also challenged in the court, and those challenges have been consistently rejected up through the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. So this bill does not preclude future entities from coming into Kansas to explore transmission acquisition or transmission partnership, transmission development with the utilities in the state that serve the retail ratepayers. All those activities are subject to some level of state and federal regulation. None of them would be precluded by this bill. An example would be the approach that ITC Great Plains took to building transmission in the state. We were not selected or mandated to the state of Kansas to build a single mile of transmission in the state. What we did was we came into the state, we met with the Kansas Electric Transmission Authority, we met with committees like this committee, we met with all the utilities in the state, we met with the Kansas Corporation Commission, we met with the Southwest Power Pool, we helped evaluate the transmission needs of the state. Ultimately, cooperatives in western Kansas, both Midwest Energy and Sunflower, entered into partnership agreements that they had determined were in the best interest of the ratepayers that they serve, and they gave us the opportunity to build nearly $500 million worth of high voltage transmission that was badly needed in the state of Kansas. Very different approach than just going through a process where the federal government says, you can build this project, you have no relationship to the retail ratepayers, no relationship to the Kansas utilities, and go build transmission, you'll be federally rate regulated. We think that that approach is the better approach to competition for transmission, and the state of Kansas will not be precluded by this bill. And in fact, there are many other companies that have pursued a similar strategy successfully that already have development agreements, various form of partnership arrangements. I don't know the details of those. Of course, those are confidential commercial arrangements that other entities have made with utilities in the state. but often there are press releases announcing when these deals are done. That sort of thing, people competing with ITC and with other utilities for the opportunity to partner with and build needed transmission in Kansas will continue. The other thing is to keep in mind that, of course, when an incumbent transmission owner builds transmission, they are able to bring rigorous competition to the cost of that project through the processes that they run. We happen to live in an area of the country with many of the finest engineering companies in the world that compete to work with these transmission companies. We have contractors, we have tower manufacturers. All these things are competitively bid, subject to economies of scale that the utilities can bring to bear. So it's not that transmission companies in this state are not building things at a reasonable cost and bringing many elements of competition to bear on that ultimate transmission cost. So let's see here. I think I will quiet down, and I would take questions from members of the committee.
Senator Fagg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Brett, thank you for your presentation. I'm sitting here, I've got a question for you. I'm kind of turning this around. When we talk about projects in Kansas where we pay 17, outside of Kansas pays 83, when Kansas pays in other projects in Southwest Power Pool states that has ROFR, is Kansas paying extra cost in the formula if we don't have that? Follow what I'm trying to turn this backwards here.
Well, again, this gets to the fundamental question where, as my map reflects, an increasing number in many of the states in the region have already implemented rights of first refusal, and so their incumbent utilities are exercising that right, and they're building those projects subject to competing with vendors and material providers, as I was describing. I can also tell you that the Southwest Power Pool planning process, which has been, I think, dramatically slowed and extended by Order 1000, even under normal circumstances, it's rigorous, it's detailed, it's comprehensive. It should be, because these projects are expensive. They're going to be serving customers in the states and the regions for many, many years to come. And so they're fairly conservative in evaluating the cost-benefit ratios of the project. So if one of these bigger regional projects, a 345 kV project in particular, gets approved in order to be built by Southwest Power Pool, they've got studies that demonstrate costs, benefits in excess of costs, and those costs are going to be based on estimates typically provided by the incumbent transmission owner in those states with a right of first refusal. So, to answer your question, it is absolutely true that just as we're paying 16.5% of the cost, or 17%, whatever it is, for those larger projects in the other states as well. So if they're above 300 kilovolt and they're regionally allocated, Kansas is going to pay 16.5, 17% of the cost. But in terms of the impact on ratepayers, as I said, if you believe like we do that the evidence shows that right of first refusal is in the interest of ratepayers in delivering these projects more quickly, more timely, and at a reasonable cost, not only on day one, but for the duration of that project, other states are regulating and managing those costs while they have a right of first refusal.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So following up on that question, since so many of the other areas in the SPP are governed by that right of first refusal, the Kansas portion of that support would help electric utilities in those other states who can get the rate of return back for their investments. So it actually does in some ways help those incumbent
Reduces-
utilities.
Reduces rates for everyone in the region would be our position, but particularly here in Kansas where we don't have the right of first refusal today.
You got a quick follow-up?
A second question would be, ITC would be considered an incumbent electric transmission owner because you have facilities within the state of Kansas?
Yes.
So you could qualify if there's connection. What happens if, you have a line and there's an incumbent on one end and the other end? Then who can orchestrate the right of first refusal, or does that have to be a
Yeah, that's addressed in the SPP tariff, and it would continue as it did before Order 1000, that the incumbent transmission owners are responsible for essentially dividing the project, agreeing to the meet point. So for instance, the Elm Creek to Summit line in north central Kansas, the northern portion of that line was the notice to construct went to ITC as the owner of the Elm Creek substation. The notice to construct on the south end of that line, the Summit substation, was probably still Westar at the time. Evergy now owned the southern substation. Basically, the ITC and the Westar engineers got together. We picked a spot, I think it's in Ottawa County, that in terms of the geography of agriculture and the roads in that region made sense to be a meet point. We built the top 30 miles, they built the southern 30 miles. You meet in the middle, and that's how that would be handled.
Senator Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With all these other states having passed this, is there any litigation out there, and what's the status of those cases?
My best understanding of the litigation is the Fifth Circuit, the case out of Texas, which again is a ROFR, very different in language and approach than our ROFR, has been ruled on by the Fifth Circuit, and I believe there's a cert petition pending at the United States Supreme Court. And so at some point in the foreseeable future, the Supreme Court will decide whether or not they're going to hear that case. The Eighth Circuit case, which originated out of Minnesota, has been ruled and on by the Eighth Circuit and determined that the ROFR in the form that it exists in Minnesota, which is what we modeled our bill off after, was legal and appropriate. And to my knowledge, I don't think a cert petition has been filed with the Eighth Circuit or with the Supreme Court on the Eighth Circuit decision, but I don't know that with certainty. I will tell you, people sometimes think it's strange when we say we'd like you to pass a state law to opt out of federal regulation. What about the federal supremacy clause? Well, Order 1000 expressly provided on day one, I think recognizing that this was a controversial and unique intrusion into an area that traditionally state regulators and state legislators had governed, that essentially, if you don't like our federal process, then pass a state right of first refusal, and you can continue the way that you handled things before the federal government came in with their order.
So this bill is modeled after the Minnesota law?
Minnesota and Iowa and Michigan, yes.
And Minnesota's been litigated in the Eighth?
Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, yes.
Senator Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll make it quick. Just to clarify in my mind, say there was a big transmission line project that went interstate, Kansas, Missouri, whatever. The ROFR, if we pass it, would only pertain to our state. So one big interstate line could not be bid on by another entity. Is that correct?
So in that scenario, let's say hypothetically somebody were to plan a project from near Wolf Creek to some spot in eastern Missouri. The notice to construct for the Kansas portion of that project, if a right of first refusal were in place, would have been issued to Evergy as the owner of the Wolf Creek substation. Missouri, which I think has a ROFR pending in their legislature but has not passed that into law, I believe that in that instance, the Southwest Power Pool would probably initiate a competitive process for that, mile and a half of the line. And if people wanted to bid for something, of that investment level, they could do that.
Okay, thank you.
That's my best understanding.
We got 3 more minutes, so anybody else have a question? Let's see. Okay, well, okay. Thank you again, Brett, and we appreciate both of you guys testifying. We'll go ahead and suspend the hearing and pick it back up tomorrow. We have some more proponents tomorrow, and then we'll shift to opponents on the 3rd day. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.